Oh,
No, he is. He went through till 2 o'clock.
Oh, I did go to 2.
Well, what time did you get to?
1. I got to the last wicket.
Of course.
Once Anderson got hit in the head, I knew it was all over.
Yeah. And as for Johnny Bairstow, if you want sympathy, stay in your crease, champ. Real good. Testing 1, 2. David Chris Foley, Tim Mander, 1, 2, 3. The LNP is today calling on the state Labor government to adopt our solutions when it comes to the Housing Investment Fund. Queensland's Housing Investment Fund must exclusively be used for new construction, not to buy into a market that is already under immense pressure. Failure to increase supply will result in a generation of misery for those looking to buy their first home, those looking to rent their first home, or those most vulnerable who deserve a social roof over their head. We have spoken and listened to too many Queenslanders living out of their cars, too many Queenslanders who, for them, a tent has become their new home. And for the government to fail to admit that it is in crisis stage, to admit that it is getting worse, and to acknowledge that unless we increase supply, particularly around social housing, nothing will change, is deeply disappointing. We again call on the government to listen to the opposition, to industry, to those who are living out of their vehicles, and acknowledge that the Housing Investment Fund must be used to increase new dwellings. Anything short will ensure that a generation of a housing crisis victims continue. Before I ask Tim to make some comments, I don't want to let the opportunity pass to again comment on the issues that we are seeing in First Nations community when it comes to the health crisis. It's been 7 days since I was in the Torres Strait, 7 days since we called on the Premier and the Minister to visit those communities, 7 days since local leaders united as one to say that the terms of reference must be set and guided with assistance from those on the ground, and 7 days since we demanded the government listen to those solutions and make sure that that review is done at arm's length to Queensland Health. We haven't heard a thing. Not a single acknowledgement about how dire the crisis is in the Cape and the Torres Strait, and not a single acknowledgement that the Premier and the Minister must both get there immediately and listen to the solutions and commit that the review must be done independently and the terms of reference must be set in acknowledgement with those people on the ground. It's now been 3 days since the coroner has handed down findings into the tragic death of 3 women in Doomadgee. 3 days, and we want the government to acknowledge how bad the situation is. We want an acknowledgement that rheumatic heart disease should be eradicated across this state. It's unacceptable, some of the conditions that have been explained in that report that have led to tragedies that should never be the case in a modern Queensland. And we want the government to listen, we want the government to set timelines, we want reviews done on those previous statements that were made several years ago, and we want an acknowledgement that this can't continue to happen. We cannot continue to fail First Nations communities when it comes to the health service in the way that it is happening at the moment. G'day, Tim.
Thanks, David. There is absolutely no doubt that Queensland's housing crisis has got worse since the housing summit that was held late last year. The reason for that is that this government, when it comes to housing, is all about announcements and not about delivery. There's no greater evidence for that than the media statement that I have here made over 12 months ago, where the government announced a pipeline of 1,500 houses supposedly to be built out of the Housing Investment Fund. Out of that 1,500, to date, only 188 have been announced, and of those, 32 of those are supposed to be built at Chermside by September, and not a sod has been turned on that site. Let me say again, the government is all about announcements and not about delivery. And then yesterday we had the Housing Minister blaming everybody but themselves. It's the council's fault. It's developers' fault. It's landlords' fault. Well, this government needs to look in the mirror and realise that the crisis has got worse under Labor. Let's not forget, from the Housing Summit, there were many promises that were made and have failed to be delivered. We had the Griffith University student accommodation. We had the Granny Flat announcement. We had all the investment from the Housing Investment Fund supposedly being introduced. We've had the prefab home promise. 2 out of 80 have been built. And of course the Productivity Commission that says we are the only state in the nation where community housing has actually gone backwards. This government needs to look at itself and not blame others for the crisis that we are experiencing at the moment, and the victims, unfortunately, are vulnerable Queenslanders.
Over to you.
David, some in the industry are saying that things like the rental reforms have spooked investment, particularly, I guess, those mum and dad investors. What are the other people to change those reforms?
Well, the LNP will deliver calm and considered leadership and an end to the chaos and crisis. And the problem that we're seeing right now is nobody trusts the government. And that's manifested both from investors and everyday Queenslanders. And when that happens, is it any wonder why people are cautious about investing? Because things can change at a moment's notice. So when we make our commitment ahead of the next election for taxation policy, for expenditure, for the way that those mechanics of those announcements will run, people will be able to invest on that. People will be able to know as Queenslanders that that promise will matter for something. The government can't say the same thing. They promised 26 times before the last election there'd be no new or increased taxes, 26 times, and they have broken it time and time again. That sends shivers up the spine of Queenslanders. It sends shockwaves through the investment community, and unfortunately, when that happens, it is vulnerable Queenslanders who pay the highest price.
The housing summit, is that sort of being proven out to be a waste of time?
I might get Tim to discuss that.
Look, the really unfortunate thing about the Housing Summit was that there was so much goodwill. People came together realising that we have an issue and that we need to work together. But the government hasn't honoured that goodwill. They've made many promises, some of those that I've just outlined, and they haven't delivered on them. And one of the things that was said at the Housing Summit, which the government just failed to understand, is that we have a crisis, and therefore we should be treating it like we'd treat any other crisis, whether it's bushfires, whether it's floods, cyclones, all those situations that Queenslanders face. So that's why the sector is so upset, because there was so much goodwill and they have seen that the situation has actually got worse. There have never been more people sleeping in parks and in their cars, and that's simply not acceptable for a modern society and a modern state like Queensland.
When you got to the housing crisis getting worse since the Housing Summit, how much do you actually put that down to the Queensland government's management of the issues, and how much do external factors, be it the RBA lifting rates or whatever?
Well, the Queensland government's policies definitely haven't helped. We've already talked about spooking the market with regards to the extra impost on landlords, and the evidence is suggesting that investors have got out of the market. And that's one of the problems that we have. We have a supply issue. So the government is not addressing the key issue, and the key issue is increasing supply. What they seem to be doing is going to an already strained rental market and taking houses out of that sector to put into social housing. That's not solving the bigger problem. That's actually making the situation worse.
Tim, so how do we boost supply quickly?
Well, the policy setting that David announced during the budget reply speech is an important one. The Housing Investment Fund, anything that comes from that, should be about increasing supply, constructing new houses. The other thing we must do is mobilise the community housing sector. The government can't do all this by themselves, but they seem to ignore the opportunity that is staring them in the face, and that's the community housing sector. We are the only state that has not embraced the community housing sector. In every other state, no matter what political persuasion, the community housing sector has grown. In Queensland, it's gone backwards. So they're the type of things that we need to look at. We also need to look at how we can do things quickly. And the only ways that we can do that is by having state development and planning, the Deputy Premier's responsibility, looking at this as a crisis situation so we can fast-track housing, emergency housing.
There was a report today that something like the Rural Plan proposed by the BCC to get
Well, this is the tragedy of the situation, is that the government is actually blaming councils. I've had councils right across the state that are really trying to fill the gap that's been created by the state government. And they're donating land, they're trying to get housing up quickly, but they are thwarted by state planning laws. And that's a great example of what you're saying, that they, on one hand, say they are trying to get extra housing, but on the other hand are making it more difficult for local councils and for developers to actually make that happen.
The Treasurer said, I think it was on Budget Day, that it's not a matter of money, it's a matter of other issues like the construction industry will be at breaking point and not enough workers and that kind of thing. Is that a real fact that you think?
Look, there's no doubt that the construction sector has been under strain, but that has been recovering slowly but surely. But that's not the reason. That's not the main reason that we're not having a fulfilment of promises. They are just continuing to give false hope and making announcements which either they know they can't deliver or they're incapable of delivering. And both of those options are not acceptable. There just doesn't seem to be the will to actually increase the supply of housing.
Yep. You can't have a situation where promises are made, announcements are trumpeted, but there's never any KPIs to hold people accountable. And we are seeing that across every service delivery failure in Queensland at the moment. Whether it's health, housing, youth crime, the consistent theme is the government will always find a way to make an announcement, but no one is ever held accountable. And the issues in Caboolture are a case in point. There is a dozen reviews that have been announced, but nobody knows what they are. Nobody knows when it's going to come to the fore. There's no set timelines on when this will be fixed. And if you want proof of how much that region is hungry to be listened to, we had over 50 RSVPs within the first 24 hours of announcing that we'd be out there on Thursday. This is going to be an opportunity for Queenslanders to have their story told and to drive some change for them. It will also be our opportunity to hold the government accountable and start getting some of those timelines and KPIs attached. It's all well and good for ministers to say their heart goes out and announce something else. Someone has to be held accountable for the deterioration in health services that has happened year on year over the last 8 years.
Do you think the announcement of a review appeases people perhaps the way it did one years ago?
People are growing tired of the state government in Queensland constantly announcing reviews because it hasn't led to anything across all the crises they are experiencing in their daily lives. They've worked the Premier out, and that is that it's always about how can we relieve pressure on ourselves, not pressure on the system. And as a result, Queenslanders no longer trust them to fix the things that matter to them.
David, what were your initial thoughts on the report?
It shows that it was always about a get square. It was never about providing a response to the health issues. It was always about trying to provide a one-up on the federal government. And the report shows just how dire those consequences are. And it also confirmed just how big that bill is. And it confirms the government is addicted to a culture of secrecy. And the fact that the state government has refused to accept the recommendation that would see the culture of commercial in confidence change shows you that nothing has changed and nothing will change until the government changes in Queensland.
Do you think the report justifies all of the opposition's criticisms of WellCare?
And more. And Queenslanders continue to remember why it was such a bad decision. And it was called out as a bad decision at the time, and it hasn't aged well for the government. And when governments are always obsessed about making announcements either for political survival or political expediency, in the end it's taxpayers who pay. It was a waste, and it was called that at the time, and it's subsequently been revealed to be the case.
Any other questions? That's it?
No, I thought there was a law and order one.
Yeah, youth crime.
Was it?
In terms of youth crime, looking at
Yeah.
The victims, I guess they're victims now, or they're also victims of
Yeah. Someone isn't just a victim when a crime occurs, they remain a victim. And right now, their rights run a distant second to the rights of the criminals, and that has to change. Righto, thanks.
Thank you.